Great. Hello, everyone. So we're going to start the symposium, Virtual Power, AI, Ableism, Racism, and Fascism now. I'm Fintan Mallory. I'm a white guy with black hair, a white shirt, and a green tie, and a poor excuse for a mustache. I'm a philosopher at Durham University in the north of England and an associate fellow at the Leverhulme Centre for Algorithmic Life. I work on the philosophy of machine learning and its connections to science. So these days, I'm also looking at quite a bit more at the connections between this new technology and political economy from a broadly Marxist perspective. Before we start, I'll just remind everyone that captioning is available. There should be a tab at the bottom of your screen, and you can change the font size for the captions down there. And if you have any questions for the presenters, just put them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. Feel free to use the chat box to chat throughout talks, but questions will be sought from the Q&A box. And our speakers today are going to be Raymond Aldred, Mich, Ciurria, Johnathan Flowers, and Damien Williams. So we're going to be starting with Raymond. Raymond's a PhD student at the philosophy department at McGill and a senior data analyst in one of Canada's banks. He's a member of the Métis Nation and a descendant of the historic Red River Métis Nation. And his chapter, A Secret Bond, Indigenous Reflections on Disability, Love and the Church, is forthcoming in a collection on theology. His talk is entitled Confessions of an Indigenous AI Frankenstein. And the way this is going to go is we're going to have 20-minute talks followed by 10 minutes for Q&A for each speaker. So hopefully we can all welcome Raymond now. Great, thanks.
Hello, everyone. So can everyone hear me? All right. So first of all, my name is Ray Aldred. I have a blue jean shirt, button-up shirt with white undershirt. I'm wearing a newsboy hat, and I have blue eyes. So I look white, but I'm not really. I'm kind of mixed. And I also want to mention my land claim here. So Montreal, or as my friends in Oka and Kanawake call it, Jojate, which translates where the group parted ways. It is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mohawk Nation. It has historically been a gathering place for many First Nations people, and I acknowledge the role as custodians of the land and waters, often extending to other nations such as the Wendat and the Anishinaabe. So before my talk, I want to mention John Hunter had a really good paper before me, and what I'm going to talk about might loosely be based on what he's discussed. So when people debate whether AI threatens human intelligence or whether students should be allowed to use it in classrooms, they rarely consider who gets extended for these conversations. The person who relies on AI to write after a stroke left me with aphasia. I find myself caught between competing narratives: AI as an existential threat, AI as a cheating tool, and AI as an inevitable and often tragic future. None of these narratives make space for people like me, for whom AI is an accessibility technology that enables my participation. So this talk examines how anxieties around AI repeat a historical pattern of technological moral panic, one that frames cognitive assistance as a form of cognitive decline or cognitive disability. I trace this history from Plato's writings, warnings about writing, to contemporary fears about large language models, arguing that though these concerns often rely on ableist assumptions about what counts as legitimate thinking. Alongside this historical analysis, I address specifically Indigenous concerns about AI, including data sovereignty violations and potential needs for fundamentally different epistemological frameworks for understanding artificial intelligence. Throughout, I draw on my own experiences experience navigating academic spaces that increasingly police technology use in ways that creates forms of disability, forcing people who need technological assistance to repeatedly disclose, justify, and advocate for access tools that others take for granted. So first, I should explain why I titled my talk after a Frankenstein-like creature. I am drawn to horror films for some reason, and I recently watched Guillermo del Toro's excellent adaptation of Frankenstein, which prompted several feelings and reflections about the creature. Following the interpretive approach that I was taught in my culture, to listen closely to how stories are told and identify with every being in it. I found myself identifying with the creature, particularly in his later sections when he begins to narrate his own experience. The creature is cognitively and linguistically disabled, partly because he's treated as such, but also because his body, mind, language, and origins are shaped by societal norms and power structures that determine what counts as normal and valuable. He is marked, in other words, as abnormal or without value, which partly constitutes his disability. Additionally, several scholars, including Eileen Botting, in her book Artificial Life After Frankenstein, consider Mary Shelley the mother of modern political science fiction through her novels Frankenstein and The Last Man. Botting argues that Shelley created a new genre concerned with ethics and politics of creating artificial life. Given the connection between Frankenstein, disability, and questions about artificial intelligence, the title seemed apt. So what exactly is AI? So Ronald Kuso, author of How AI Works for Sorcery to Science and the technical text Math for Deep Learning, defines artificial intelligence as attempts to make machines behave in ways humans judge to be intelligent. This definition is deliberately broad, encompassing everything from early systems to contemporary approaches. Modern AI predominantly relies on deep learning and neural networks. So basically, I just define what exactly modern AI predominantly relies on: deep learning and neural networks. And these are layers of interconnected nodes that adjust their connections during training, enabling them to recognize patterns, generate text, translate language, and perform other tasks that once seemed uniquely human. What matters for this discussion is not the technical architecture, but rather what counts as intelligent behavior. When we define AI by human standards of intelligence, we often encode assumptions about cognition, rationality, and capability. These assumptions carry consequences for how we understand both artificial and human intelligence, particularly when we begin policing the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate uses of cognitive assistance. So how does AI help? So I had a stroke about 5 years ago. As a result, I acquired several additional disabilities, including aphasia, which left me unable to speak for a period, though I could understand everything said to me. Due to the damage on my left brain, using my right dominant hand became very difficult. So I don't write with handwriting much, and I must use a computer. I sometimes joke that I essentially had to relearn everything from scratch, from transferring into my wheelchair, to eating again, to talking again, to writing and drawing and painting with my left hand. Now, through neuroplasticity and extensive speech therapy, I can speak again, though writing still requires AI assistance. So let me walk you through my writing process and the AI tools I use. Every time I write, I rely on autocorrect and predictive and suggested text because I have to type with one hand. Both tools use AI trained on my typical word patterns, which makes typing significantly easier. Because of my condition, I can usually get the first two letters of the word correct, but my accuracy sometimes deteriorates depending on the word and as I continue to spell. So spelling relies on habit. However, because of my stroke, I must constantly relearn from the beginning, gradually progressing phonetically through sounds as I did in elementary school. This is rehab for me, and I do it every day, writing a word over and over again, but sometimes I just want to write. With both applications, typing just the first few letters will suggest the correct word. When I can't remember how to spell a word at all, but can recall its pronunciation, I use speech to text to find the correct spelling. This tool uses AI trained on my voice, so it typically understands what I'm trying to say. The more I use it, the more accurate it becomes. Due to my aphasia, I sometimes lose access to the word I want to use. Though I can remember the first letter and loosely its meaning. Large language models excel at retrieving words based on partial information like this. They are incidentally also excellent at crosswords. However, if you use LLMs to do crosswords, you probably have too much time on your hands and you are robbing yourself of the actual fun of doing it. I also use a spell checker, which is now standard practice. Interestingly, critics once warned that spell checkers would cause our brains and cognitive system to atrophy. Linguists, for example, worried that they would weaken spelling proficiency and vocabulary retention, though it remains unclear to me whether such concerns still hold currency. Once I have drafted a paragraph, I run it through several editors to refine it. I typically enter the paragraph into Claude and ask it to edit it thoughtfully, requesting that it lists all the edits at the bottom with explanations so I can understand the changes and the rationale. It also helped me to learn about where I need to learn, how I can use my language again. Sometimes I decline the suggested edits, particularly when Claude inserts m dashes or uses words like foundational, essential, or essentially, terms whose philosophical implications I do not share or that are overstated. Other times, however, it offers genuinely helpful sentence-level improvements. Next, I review the text in Grammarly, evaluating any flagged issues, and examine how different versions might restructure my sentences and word choices. Throughout this process, I could continually reconsider word choices and sentence structure, revising as needed. This approach is extensive, probably more involved than most people's writing, but it's important to note that AI does not necessarily replace or supplant what I intended to actually say, as many people think it will. I do not believe AI is inherently fascistic, racist, or biased, because I'm an externalist. However, it can exhibit all these characteristics depending on the data used to train the models, the prompts users provide, or the decisions its creators make, all of which are equally troubling. Fascists can and do use AI for fascistic purposes, and evidence as evidenced by some of the most biased large language models currently in use, like Elon Musk's Grok. So now I'll mention the Indigenous current concerns for AI. So there are at least two major concerns about AI and Indigenous people that I will address today. First is Indigenous data sovereignty. Indigenous data sovereignty has been the organizing framework for understanding Indigenous AI concerns. A landmark 2025 systematic review in Big Data and Society by Pereira and colleagues examined the 2012 to 2023 literature on AI's intersection with Indigenous knowledge systems, finding that AI poses significant risk of cultural knowledge erosion and data extraction that fails to respect Indigenous data sovereignty principles. The researchers warned that AI systems trained on historically biased data perpetuate harmful, deficient narratives, with predictive algorithms in child protection services disproportionately referring Indigenous children for intervention. In response, care principles, collective benefits, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics developed the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, has emerged as a primary ethical framework for Indigenous data governments in an AI context. So I'll just mention like the first segment of this, and then you can like intuit what exactly the other ones will be. So collective benefits, data ecosystems shall be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous people to derive benefit from the data, including inclusive development and innovation, right? So all of these are about how taking the data will help Indigenous people, right? So Kaneo Mahona, a native Hawaiian technologist and CDO of the Haiku Media, warns that data is the last frontier of colonization. However, I would argue it runs deeper than that, than being the last frontier. Data abstraction has been a staple of colonization. The colonizers took Indigenous people's artifacts and placed them in museums. They also took their very blood from us for different studies that Indigenous people did not know their blood was being donated, or maybe if not donated, stolen for. This raw data paints the history of people taking from Indigenous people and loosely frames the mistrust of those who take their data. For example, for those who think care is too strict, care principles exist for a reason. Collecting data without Indigenous people knowledge, consent, and meaningful participation in the process poses a problem for AI development, but it's not impossible. Some people still use AI with care in mind, in particular in Indigenous people. I know one person that's using AI to help people learn about their language. So the second thing I wanted to mention is Indigenous epistemologies and AI design. So Indigenous scholars are proposing a fundamental different approaches to AI design, conceptualizing AI as non-human kin that deserves respect. The Abundant Intelligent Project, a $22 million research program in Canada, directed by Jason Edward Lewis and Dr. Hemi Hawanga, argues that we don't have a AI ethics problem, we have an AI epistemology problem. I'm not sure exactly what he means by an epistemological problem, but the project aims to reconceptualize AI based on Indigenous knowledge systems, or what they call Indigenous AI. They refuse to center humans, whether through rationality or consciousness, and instead understand intelligence through relationships. So often they're talking about stones water, our animal relatives, and things like that. So it's not just about human intelligence. Based on my understanding of relational agency, AI could act as a partner that helps or hinders depending on how these relationships are structured. So finally, I will just mention the form of ableism I want to talk about. So this brings me to a particular form of ableism in which new technologies that externalize or automate mental and physical work are cast as threats that will weaken memory, attention, or judgment. These concerns are often framed in almost medical and ableist language: rotting, atrophy, decay, etc. I will describe it with a tongue-in-cheek manner for a few of these instances. In Plato's Phaedrus, Socrates has King Thalamus warn that writing will cause forgetfulness, because people will stop exercising their own memory and trust external marks instead. Thalamus calls writing an elixir, not of memory, but reminding, giving only the appearance of wisdom to people who have read much but understood little. After the printing press, critics complained that cheap paper, print, and popular romance would overload readers with shallow information, distracting them from serious thought and religious contemplation. A little secret about me: I kind of like cheap romances. Thank you very much. In the late 19th to early 20th centuries, critics accused mass newspapers of sensationalism and that overstimulated readers and degraded serious thinking. With television's rise in the mid-20th century, the phrase "TV will rot your brain" crystallized this older fear in a new medium. Commentators argued that passive viewing would shorten attention spans, dull critical thinking, and displace reading and conversation, especially among children. Contemporary studies have even found correlations between very high television viewing and reduced gray matter, as well as poor cognitive test performance in midlife. From the late 1990s onward, concerns shifted to the online brain. Constant connectivity, multitasking, and hyperlinked information were said to be rewiring attention and memory in apparently damaging ways. Some experiments describe brain drain from the mere presence of one's smartphone, arguing that its passivity consumes limited cognitive resources and reduces available working memory and fluid intelligence during tasks. Today, AI faces strikingly similar criticisms. Commentators warn that reliance on large language models will atrophy our writing skills, erode critical thinking, and create a generation unable to compose original thoughts. Students using AI are accused of intellectual laziness, while workers who employ it are framed as shortcut takers whose skills will inevitably decay. The language remains seemingly inconsistent. AI will rot our ability to think, weaken our capacity for deep analysis, and leave us cognitively dependent on machines and technology. Yet, this framing ignores how AI, like previous technologies, can serve as accessibility tools that enable some people to participate rather than wholly diminishing their capacity. The assumption that using AI necessarily weakens the mind reveals an ableist bias, one that privileges certain forms of unassisted cognition while dismissing as problematic the legitimate ways people might need technological support to think, write, or create. My concern is that policies governing AI use in classrooms and beyond will create a newer form of disability through exclusionary governments. Consider, for example, what happened with laptops. When studies found correlations between laptop use in class and lower grades, including evidence that students sitting near a laptop user also perform more poorly, many instructors responded by banning laptops outright, with the sole exception of students with documented disabilities. This policy framework forces me as a disabled person to approach each instructor individually to request permission to use a laptop, marking me as different and requiring repeated disclosure on my disability. The barriers extend even further. Some presumably Kantian instructors concerned with maintaining what they view as formal equality for all students in their classroom require students to register with the disability office beforehand. This means navigating bureaucratic processes, completing paperwork, and obtaining official documentation before I can access the tools I need. Other instructors refuse accommodation requests altogether. I have encountered both accessibility responses for both my partner and me. So my partner, she is a caregiver, but I still think caregivers of people with disabilities need accommodation too.
We'll need to come to an end soon. Yeah.
Okay. Yep. I'm almost done. The result in the classrooms ostensibly designed to benefit all students, instead creating systematic exclusion for those who need technological assistance to participate. And I think I'll just leave it there. So I'm done.
Okay, that's great. Thank you, Ray. The floor is now open to questions. We're getting a lot of positive comments, or we're getting some positive comments in the chat here. Just because we're a bit short of time, I'll just insert myself in here. So I found your talk really interesting, and I was wondering if some of the issues here have to do with the labeling of AI. So it seemed like many of the technologies that you discussed that enhance accessibility would, a few years ago, being regarded as, natural language processing tools that use perhaps or can be improved with statistical models of language. But now we're getting companies encouraging us to use this framing of AI to bring together a lot of technologies and the goals of those producing those technologies. And I'm wondering if you think to an extent that we could perhaps have a more fruitful conversation about the role of this technology by just jettisoning the whole framing of AI altogether. What do you think about that? Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. AI is good.
That's fair. Yeah.
but there's also there's good open source AI that doesn't require companies or anything like that. I think there's also sort of AI or LLMs that you can install on your laptop. So it really depends on what sort of AI. I don't really like certain companies because they're trying to do too much. But also these companies, they also don't include disabled people in the conversation too. So that might be a technoableism too. Yeah,
that seems like a really important angle.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're at past, so I'm afraid we'll have to move on. But thanks again, Ray, for your presentation. That was a really interesting way for us to start. And so next up, we have Mich Ciurria. Mich is a disabled queer public philosopher with specializations in ethics, moral psychology, Marxist feminism, and critical disability theory. They are the author of An Intersectional Feminist Theory of Moral Responsibility, published by Routledge in 2019, and a regular contributor to Biopolitical Philosophy. Their talk is called Technofascism, Crisis Epistemology, and Disaster Ableism. So take it away, Mich.
Thank you. I'll share my slide. Okay, and I'll just say, I'll start by describing myself. I'm a white person with medium-length brown and gray hair, wearing a black knitted sweater with a beige sweater on top because it's quite cold here. And I have invisible, episodic, and cognitive disabilities, and I'm currently recovering from COVID. So I'm very happy that this conference is online, or I wouldn't be here. And I'm presenting from Georgina, Canada, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. Okay, so without further ado, I've added a subtitle to my presentation because there's a lot that I could have talked about with respect to technofascism and technocapitalism, but I decided to focus on the incursion of technocapitalism into higher education through the pervasive use of AI, which I thought would fit in the allotted time frame. So it's a little narrower than originally anticipated. Okay. And if you want to follow my talk, I've posted it just recently on biopoliticalphilosophy.com. So you can follow there if you click on the URL. Okay. So, so technocapitalism, first of all, is a social system dominated by technology-driven capital in which technological development is a primary vehicle for wealth concentration. Professors are currently trying to navigate the incursion of technocapitalism into higher education through the widespread adoption of generative AI platforms like ChatGPT. In a recent article for Current Affairs, Professor Ronald Purser argues that AI is destroying the university by undermining critical thinking, accelerating the corporatization of higher education, and contributing to AI colonialism by desecrating the environment and displacing racialized communities to build AI servers and data centers. While some of his colleagues quickly embraced this technology, most tried to figure out how to resist it. As Purser describes his department's initial response to ChatGPT's emergence in 2022, the panic came first. Faculty meetings erupted in dread. How will we detect plagiarism now? Is this the end of the college essay? Should we go back to blue books and proctored exams? My business school colleagues suddenly behaved as if cheating had just been invented. So, seemingly the most common response to generative AI has been to revive teaching methods from 20 years ago, handwritten exams, oral tests, proctoring, and other surveillance techniques. And while this may be an effective stopgap measure, it really doesn't address the underlying reasons for the widespread adoption of generative AI in the first place. Why don't students want to learn? Or more specifically, why don't they want to learn what their professors are trying to teach them? Could something about dominant pedagogical assumptions explain why students are often so eager to outsource their learning to a chatbot? So, as professors rush to revive the pedagogies of my own college days, there's a risk of romanticizing those times that I personally remember with dread. This romanticization can be seen in Purser's own recollection of his college years in the 80s, when university was more affordable and less vocationally driven, at least for some people. Purser recalls a vision of the 20th century university that encouraged students to explore, be challenged, and figure out what mattered. That kind of education, the open, affordable, meaning seeking kind, once flourished in public universities, but now it is nearly extinct. He laments. That's his remembrance. This paints a picture of a golden age of uncommodified and accessible education, in contrast to the present deplorable state of education as a cheapened, mass marketed product. While this picture isn't totally false, we should be careful not to glamorize the past. Many academics, including myself, don't reflect fondly on the university of the past, nor do we see a firm line between past educational technologies and their present iterations. Instead, there's a through line of disciplinary strategies that have simply become more high tech in recent years. Yet these strategies have always had the same goal: to produce docile bodies. Critical pedagogy theorists from 20 to 50 years ago did not describe a golden age of academic freedom, but rather a set of disciplinary and surveillance technologies that functioned to produce obedient subjects, cogs in the neoliberal machine, molded to fit specific roles in the economy. In fact, they viewed education as a primary site of discipline, quote, establishing rhythm, imposing particular occupations, regulating the cycles of repetition, and channeling populations into differentiated regimes of power, as Foucault wrote in 1977. So let's look more closely at some of these critiques of educational power. On Foucault's analysis, formal education produces docile bodies optimized for productivity and obedience, bodies that follow rules, meet deadlines, accept positions in bullshit jobs, and assimilate into neoliberalism in a multitude of ways. This analysis extends to universities where students are, quote, subjugated by disciplinary regimes and turned into objects of knowledge, rather than being recognized as knowledge producers and epistemic authorities. Foucault's critique of neoliberal education as a disciplinary technology was echoed by many of his contemporaries. Paulo Freire, for instance, described the dominant pedagogy of the 20th century as the banking model, whereby students are positioned as passive receptacles of institutional knowledge, which is deposited in them by their teachers, and students are meant to mechanically memorize and exactly reproduce their lessons, adding nothing personal or original, similar to a chatbot processing data sets, right? Um, Bell Hooks invokes the banking model to describe her time at Stanford University, where she, quote, was enthralled with the process of becoming an insurgent Black intellectual, but the primary lesson was reinforced. Students were to learn obedience to authority. In graduate school, the classroom became a place I hated. The university and the classroom began to feel more like a prison, a place of punishment and confinement, rather than a place of promise and possibility, end quote. A part of the unspoken lesson was white supremacy, as students from marginal groups were made to feel that they were there not to learn, but to prove that they were the equal of whites. So the main emotions Hooks felt in class were not love of wisdom or curiosity, but instead boredom and apathy, in her words. As a disabled student 20 years ago, I similarly felt that the unspoken lesson of higher education was to learn obedience to able bodied supremacy. So I too felt bored, apathetic, and above all, alienated, not just by the readings, which either erased or medicalized disability, nor just the intense productivity regimes, which were designed by and for the average able bodied neurotypical knower, but also by the foundational assumptions of the university, which positions disability as outside of and oppositional to education itself. So the message was loud and clear: I don't belong here. I belong in a different type of institution. So as J. Dolmage observes, oh sorry. Yes, this is right. Okay. As J. Dolmage observes, for most of the 20th century, people with disabilities were institutionalized in asylums, schools for the feeble-minded, and other exclusionary institutions, locations that became the dark shadows of the college or university, connected with residential schools, prisons, quarantines, and immigration stations in these shadows. So these segregated institutions were still operating when I was a teenager. The last residential school didn't close until the mid 90s. So the university, along with prisons, asylums, and immigration detention centers, isn't a completely separate institution, um, but part of a technology of governance that sorts populations into those deemed worthy of investment and optimization on the one hand, and those marked for abandonment, dispossession, and displacement on the other. Professors belong to the former category, and their job is kind of to condition students to occupy authoritative roles within the neoliberal order. So the takeaway is that the pre-20th century university was a far cry from the wellspring of epistemic freedom, equality, and justice described by Purser and some other professors. In many ways, it was more exclusionary than today's education system because the exclusions were explicit and material. The architectural barriers, the curricular ableism, the punitive regimes were in many ways even more entrenched than today. So, um, I turned to Foucauldian analysis basically for this presentation in part because Foucault helps to illuminate how technologies are not simply modern inventions, but rather they encompass entire disciplinary regimes designed to regulate and optimize populations for neoliberal purposes. For Foucault, technology isn't simply a tool like a smartphone or AI. It's a dispersed set of techniques, procedures, and discourses that regulate human behavior and produce certain kinds of subjects. So, neoliberalism can be seen as a technology in this sense, one that divides populations into those worthy of investment and cultivation and those to be abandoned or excluded. Using this framework, we can see the university as a neoliberal technology that cultivates a disciplined, self managing subject oriented toward competition, productivity, and market participation. Within the technology of the university itself, there are embedded micro technologies that enforce discipline, impose obedience, and punish dissent. In the 20th century, these technologies included panopticon style classrooms with a lectern at the front and desks arranged in rows to prevent talking, cheating, and distraction, timed exams, standardized tests, and grading systems that produced a uniform type of knower and a canonic body of knowledge, as well as admissions criteria that excluded populations viewed as undisciplined or unfit. So the result was a largely white, able bodied, cisgender male student body governed by professors and administrators from the same demographic groups. The 20th century also witnessed the advent of digital ranking systems such as institutional leaderboards, citation indexes, and journal impact factors, which were digitalized at this time. And these metrics contributed to a system of digitalized surveillance that standardized and optimized academic performance, favoring quantity over quality and prestige over originality. Mark Edwards and Siddhartha Roy describe these metrics as perverse incentives that select for the most ruthless academics those willing to lie and cheat to get ahead in their careers. Maeve McKeown, in writing about the philosophy job market specifically, describes it as a Hunger Games like contest to publish in top journals, amass greater numbers of publications, and win the most grants. So, this contest, she says, has produced unbearable working conditions for academics while stifling creativity, diversity, and dissent. The result is a sludge of generic academic content that caters to general interest journals and billionaire donors. In fact, the content produced by neoliberal education is not that different from the AI slop that academics profess to hate. Formulaic writing that ignores structural inequalities and sanitizes capitalism. Charles Mills calls this slop ideal theory. Raymond calls it cisgender common sense, and Shelley Tremaine calls it neoliberal eugenics. Um, None of this philosophical slop is new. It's merely a continuation of centuries of neoliberal disciplinary regimes. Generative AI just makes it easier to produce this formulaic content in large quantities. Yet even before ChatGPT appeared on the scene, McGill lamented that, quote, almost everyone in academia has given up resisting and accepts the cards they've been dealt. They play by the rules, even though they resent them. At a time when bold new ideas and vision are needed for our crisis-laden world, a world that is literally on fire, political philosophers are busying themselves with the game. So the gamification of education may have reached new heights in the 21st century, but it was spawned by the disciplinary technologies and quantification systems of the last century. Okay. So, moving on to crisis epistemology. While the current situation is dystopian, it's important to understand that this technological crisis is precedented and familiar, simply an extension of centuries of capitalist bureaucracy. The surveillance technologies of the 21st century are continuous with the surveillance technologies of the 20th century, which served to produce docile subjects, manageable populations, and dominant discourses. Today, Proctoro has replaced panopticon style classrooms, and Turnitin.com has replaced human invigilators, but all of these technologies belong to a broader carceral continuum aimed at producing obedient knowers and hegemonic forms of knowledge. Foucault used the term carceral archipelago to describe the diffuse networks of prisons, surveillance systems, and disciplinary institutions that structure modern life, which we can take to include the neoliberal university. The low-tech 20th century university and its modern AI-powered version are not opposites, but rather two islands within the same carceral archipelago, which demonstrates the continuity of educational discipline across time, a form of discipline that discriminates against disability. So, Kyle White coined the term crisis epistemology to describe a colonial ideology that imagines crises as unprecedented and urgent. Quote, the presumption of unprecedented, he says, makes it possible to willfully forget certain previous instances or lessons related to a crisis. With respect to climate change, this presumption allows people to ignore its roots in the colonial displacement and dispossession of Indigenous peoples, a history that continues into the present. In education, there's a similar strategic forgetting of the ableist, racist, and patriarchal characteristics of 20th century education, which was critiqued by the critical pedagogists of the time. Historical reflection reveals that the surveillance regimes of the past prefigured and enabled the surveillance technologies of the present, which continue to bring education into alignment with the interests of capital. Older, disabled, and neuroqueer academics like myself vividly remember how the dominant pedagogy of the neoliberal university harmed, alienated, and excluded disabled students and other marginalized groups. Reviving those methods is at best a stopgap measure. It may temporarily block generative AI, but it also fails to address its underlying causes in neoliberalism. So White explains that the presumption of urgency suggests that swiftness of action is needed to cope with imminence. There either may be moral sacrifices that have to be made, or ethics and justice are not elevated to a level of serious attention. The urgent response to climate change is often to implement green technologies that desecrate Indigenous lands and provincialize Indigenous knowledge systems, contributing to green colonialism. So, not a solution at all, just more colonialism, essentially. Similarly, the urgent response to AI supported plagiarism is often to ban modern technologies and revert to traditional methods built by and for neurotypical non disabled knowers without consulting with those most affected. White emphasizes that consultation, consent, and collective action are the best responses to crises, not policing and surveillance. So ultimately, ultimately, the structure of higher education itself needs to be interrogated and radically changed. Some proposals that I've defended in my own writing include ungrading, eliminating predetermined learning objectives, adopting a pedagogy of play inspired by Maria Lugones, banning billionaire donations in academia, decolonizing knowledge, and revising the curriculum to focus on prison abolition and the deinstitutionalization movement. And while I don't have space to elaborate on these proposals here, they all rest on the idea that education should not be standardized, surveilled, and policed by neoliberal authorities. These techniques make it far too easy to replace learning with AI-generated slop that replicates dominant discourses and reproduces hierarchies of power. Education should not be boring and alienating as Hooks described it. It should be playful, subversive, and unruly. And until it becomes these things, people will turn to AI as a substitute for learning. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks. We have some time for questions now. So, I mean, I can get things going. So, I really enjoyed the talk because I've been in so many meetings where people are, feeling very much, oh, just when we had gotten rid of the traditional exam, or just, when we had made more accessible means of examining people, now we've been thrown back into the old way of doing things. But there's also been this kind of dimension where students who have gone through an education system that expects, or has up until they've reached university, expected nothing more than rote learning and memorization and certain forms of engagement with education. They almost seem to want already, like students, not obviously all students, but there seems to be like a call from the student body that's internalized this method of education.
Mm.
To give them something that with a very clear marking rubric, with a very clear word length, with very clearly designated structures. How do you think we get through to students like that?
It's very natural that they think that way because there's an implicit formula. So like we give them a rubric because there's an implicit formula for how to do philosophy, and AI can kind of replicate that because if these critical pedagogists and basically critical pedagogists and just critical philosophers are right that philosophers have already been producing something along the lines of AI slop. Like they've been producing something way too formulaic, generic, because they're trying to place them in top journals or basically sell them to capitalist bureaucrats. Like we've created the problem. We're all, because we're doing this, we're just churning out this formulaic content that fits with neoliberal ideology. So I guess it's not going to be a simple solution, but if students correctly assume they can game the system by asking for very specific instructions, they're going to do that because they're going to be rewarded for doing that. We have to make philosophy so diverse, so playful, like so unpredictable that there is no game book, And that's why I really like Maria Lugones, because she talks about this game of throwing stones where there's no rules. You're just throwing stones with your friend. There's no rule book. You're making it up as you go along. You can't gamify it. We have to try to make philosophy ungamifiable. Something that AI cannot easily do. So I think part of the solution is just changing how professors do philosophy, which is very I mean, can we do maybe higher education is hopeless. I don't know. I don't know if we can do it, but like that has to be part of the solution. Just make it ungamifiable.
Do we have any other questions? Because I could obviously talk about this. Like, I ask questions for hours. Oh, there.
The question, if no one else has asked one. At the one of your suggestions at the end, Mitch, was that we decolonize knowledge. What does that mean to you?
Yeah, so this is a hard one. I just added this after watching Elaine's talk, and she talked about indigenizing knowledge. So I yeah, this is a good point, but I think one of the things I've talked about and that I've written about in the Oxford Encyclopedia entry is really focusing on the problems of incarceration and institutionalization, which I think are related, and these problems have led to basically ICE and strict immigration policing. These things are all connected through the carceral archipelago, right? So I know that when I taught philosophy classes, I would center them on institutionalization and segregated institutionalization. So I think that should be a focus of teaching because it's a really core problem in modernity. And in the history of capitalism, for profit incarceration. So yeah, I think that should really be central to any sort of ethics, philosophy, or value theory class. That would be one way of sort of centering indigeneity, Black studies, and disability theory. But surprisingly, there's very little focus on institutionalization, even in the midst of ICE raids. Like, what is this but an extension of forcible institutionalization? It's an extension of the prison industrial complex, asylums, you know, the nursing home industrial complex, and now we have immigrants and even citizens being sent to immigration camps by modern day American Gestapo. Like, we could have talked about this problem sooner. So yeah, really focusing on deinstitutionalization would be it's going to be like a complex, there's not one way of decolonizing knowledge, but certainly decarceration is central to that project.
Okay, I
So-
just want to say that, Fintan, there are two questions in the
Yep.
Q&A, but if you don't see them, they're also in
Oh yeah,
there. Okay.
Yeah, my apologies. There have been a spate of very interesting questions in the Q&A that I wasn't able to see. So we have one here from Melinda. So shall I just read out the questions? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So this
Please.
is about alienation. So how can higher education restore some form of humanity to our pedagogy when we're embedded in these larger forms of alienation? Is there a practice of non-alienated pedagogy, and from where might that come?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I kind of leave the answers open in the end because I'm kind of focusing on the genealogical analysis of how academia became so corporatized, partly through the incorporation of these capitalistic technologies, surveillance technologies, and quantification systems. So I think, I guess the solution would be, um, yeah, to kind of rehumanize education, to center the person, right? And combat the alienation of students and professors. It's such a complex project, but um, 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 I th I think quantification is a big problem. So I actually have a forthcoming paper on ungrading and how even the process of grading and ranking students is dehumanizing because you're reducing them to a number and a place within a grading hierarchy. And I think that in and of itself is very alienating. And grading actually was only invented, I think, in the 18th century at elite British universities. So they introduced a grading system as a way of allowing professors to assess students more quickly because they were increasing class sizes. So it's kind of like a factory where you're grading a product. Like the professor started introducing a grading system to grade students faster so they wouldn't have to give individualized feedback. It's just like A, B, C, D. You get a grade now, because in individual feedback and personal mentoring relationships are too time consuming. So I think that reducing quantification would help greatly, and just focusing on relationships rather than surveillance and quantification. Like, how can we foster meaningful relationships with students instead of aggressively policing them? Because they know that it's almost like we've replaced the function of education. We've substituted policing for learning as as the main function for education, because we're students are under the presumption that they're going to be policed, and we're introducing these 20th century old-fashioned pedagogical methods specifically to police them on the assumption that they are guilty. So they walk into the classroom as presumptive criminals, and it's like, we're going to give you oral exams now because we assume you're all cheaters. So it's kind of creating a carceral environment for students, I think, and an environment of distrust where relationships are being harmed. So we're keeping the grading, and we're, kind of diminishing the relationships and the community, the sense of community. So I think, yeah, we have to really try to limit quantification or get rid of it, focus on relationships and community. Um, and another thing Kyle White talks about is removing urgency. So basically implementing a slower kind of democracy, a slower kind of democratic system where relationships and cooperation and consent take place over quick fixes. Because we're a society, basically he's saying something like, we're a society of quick fixes. Like, there's climate change, so kick Indigenous people off their land and put solar panels there. Quick fix. So that's an extension of colonialism, because it's never going to solve climate change, because it's more of the same colonial displacement that got us to this position in the first place. So instead of building those relationships to restore community and equality, we're still just displacing marginalized groups. So I think education should also be slower. It focused on slowly building cooperation and consent and relationships, and not relying on these quick fixes like grading, quantification. Oh, let's just quickly rush through these grading systems that are totally unfamiliar to students from 40 years, like, without the students' consent or cooperation. We're just going to introduce a new system of quantification. So yeah, I think education's very bureaucratic, very paternalistic, and very ableist. So we have to change those things.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to need to go on to the next speaker now, but thank you, Mich, for that. So our next speaker is going to be Johnathan Flowers. Johnathan is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Northridge. His research areas include African American intellectual history, Japanese aesthetics, American pragmatism, philosophy of disability, and philosophy of technology. His first monograph, Mono no Aware and Gender as Affect in Japanese Aesthetics and American Pragmatism, was published by Lexington Books in 2023. Johnathan, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Let me share my slides real quickly. And I think I actually owe one of our other presenters, Damien Williams, a bit of a shout out for the image on the title slide. So to be clear, the purpose of this this talk is to unite some themes that I see within the theoretical structures of Technoableism and the curative imaginary as structured by Alison Kafer and Eli Clare, among others, and then apply these or then apply these sort of continuities to the situation of artificial or to the situation of artificial intelligence and AI in general, and to do so, or AI in as deployed as assistive or other kinds of technologies aimed at intervening in disabled life. And to do so, I'm going to do a little bit of expansion on Kafer's curative imaginary through the work of John Dewey, which will hopefully make clear the ways that I am thinking about the curative imaginary as not simply oriented with reference to crypt futures, as is often the case in the literature, but also structuring the transactions between able-bodied and persons and the disabled world. Now, before we get going, one of the things that I have to say is that I am, or one of the things that I want to make clear is that when I am speaking of artificial intelligence, I am speaking of it generally, given the ways in which artificial intelligence through the or through what Olufemi Taiwo describes as elite capture and Meredith Whitaker describes as capture in general has come to stand as a metonym for any advanced computational or autonomous technology. It becomes more difficult to discursively distinguish between supposed good AI and bad AI. As Whitaker notes, in 2012, tech companies quickly shifted to rebrand their existing machine learning or other statistical analysis technologies as artificial intelligence in order to capture the then nascent but growing artificial intelligence bubble and the funding opportunities that came with it. Stanford University here in California, for example, reshaped our broad discursive understanding of artificial intelligence by introducing the term foundation models, which from a technological standpoint are not functionally distinct from GPTs or other large language models. And yet the ways in which a foundation model was branded as such allowed Stanford and other researchers to distance themselves from the then growing body of criticism regarding GPTs. Now, to be clear, this is also the case in the space of disability technology. So, for example, Phonak, who develops hearing aid technologies, claims that it has been innovating in the AI field for over 24 years. This is a lie, except insofar as machine learning technologies are now increasingly being rebranded as artificial intelligence. And to be clear, Phonak hearing aids and Phonak as a company was on the forefront of incorporating machine learning technologies into their hearing aids to deliver or to address problems of sound isolation, volume control, and other issues that plagued hearing aid technology prior to the introduction of machine learning algorithms. All of this is to say that when I am making the critique of artificial intelligence in this talk, I am intentionally not distinguishing between what we might call good AI and bad AI due to the ways in which the discursive landscape has flattened out the term AI despite attempts to push back against it. So to this end, while there may be some valuable uses of AI technologies, e.g. in hearing aids, in screen readers, in some forms of automated captioning, it is impossible to distinguish between these good uses of AI and bad uses of AI due to the ways in which the discursive landscape of AI has been poisoned. Thus, While I recognize that there are valuable uses for the suite of technologies known as AI in the space of disability, I cannot affirm the positive sort of impact of AI on disability technology. Having said all of that, the core of this still growing project is to bring technoableism into conversation with the curative imaginary, such that the curative imaginary becomes the as Charles Mills says, or Charles Mills describes in the racial contract, the sort of cognitive structures that enable the maintenance of something like technoableism, right? So if we are going to be analytic about it, the curative imaginary is a second order structure that drives technoableism with as the first order manifestation. And now Ashley Shue describes technoableism as a belief in the power of technology that considers the elimination of disability a good thing and something that we should strive for. And so technoableism, like ableism itself, serves to organize how we understand disability in the lives of disabled people, particularly in terms of technological interventions. And so insofar as technoableism, at least on my view, indicates how technologies extend and reassert ableist bias, we might think about technoableism as particularly with reference to the capture of broad machine learning technologies as a social and economic system within which technologies are designed and developed, right? So technoableism, insofar as it advocates for the use of technologies to eliminate disability itself, rather than or to eliminate disability itself, rather than eliminate the social structures which give rise to marginalized persons, reflects a choice to focus on objects over systems, right? Technology over persons. And in her text against technoableism, Shue presents the resistance of the deaf community to cochlear implants as indicative of the ways that technoableism drives technological development, right? So under a technoableist framework, deafness is a problem to be fixed through the development of technologies which correct the presumed problem of, say, hearing loss. Now, this perspective, insofar as this is the case, ignores the ways that the deaf community understands itself to be a distinct culture and a linguistic minority. And so deaf resistance to cochlear implants, despite being framed by techno-optimists and folks who buy into the techno-ableist framework as sort of, or as a resistance that was grounded in ignorance, is rooted in a resistance to a loss of a culture and the imposition of a technological solution that only emerges or only appears as problematic when considered from the standpoint of deaf persons and the deaf community, right? Beyond this, technoableism relies on what Tucker calls technocapitalist disability framework or disability rhetoric, wherein corporate interests serve to capture the movement for disability, or the movement for the liberation of disabled persons by supplying technological solutions as the end to disabled oppression or ableist structures. That is to say that the technology is framed as the resolution to the social issues prompted by the organization of society around ableism. And insofar as this is the case, techno-capitalist disability framework or techno-capitalist disability rhetoric not only involves an inherent techno-ableist presumption that technology is the best way to resolve the structures of oppression faced by disabled persons, but it also carries with it the idea that disability is a problem in need of a technological solution. And so as or disability is a problem in need of a technological solution. Crucially, techno-capitalist disability rhetoric takes technoableism a step further by transforming the disabled person into a tool to bolster a company's public image. And in so doing, it enables, as Tucker states, the instrumentalization of disabled persons by suggesting that they are a valuable location for testing new and undeveloped technology. To go back to the case of hearing aids, Google currently has a project where it invites folks to record their voices for the sake of improving vocal recognition technology for not simply for their speech-to-text functions, and to provide the results of this research to hearing aid companies, but also to improve their algorithmic technologies where audio recognition is concerned. Essentially, to improve the kinds of audio surveillance technology commonly deployed in law enforcement circumstances. So to be clear, right, technoableism, in my view, is most often countered in our day-to-day lives through techno-capitalist disability rhetoric, which is made manifest in, say, the capture of machine learning applications within technologies of disability under the term artificial intelligence, the promotion of, say, wheelchairs that walk as solutions to unstable infrastructure and other such disability dongles. Now, in my view, much of what emerges from technoableism, including techno-capitalist disability rhetoric, has its source in Alison Kafer's curative imaginary. Now, for Kafer, the curative imaginary is a structure that shapes the ways in which able-bodied persons can only imagine engaging with disability in the mode of intervention, right? Kafer, as she notes, uses curative rather than cure because she is concerned with the compulsory nature of able-bodied and able-mindedness. And in essence, the curative imaginary aims not simply at the elimination or intervention into disability, but also covers the disciplining of disabled bodies, what Rosemary Garland Thompson calls the misfit, into line with the presumptions of an ableist or able-bodied or society organized around able-bodied subjects, right? Insofar as this is the case, the curative imaginary often imagines its interventions not simply not in the mode of intervening in the social structures that maintain ableist oppression, but intervention into the lives, bodies, and experiences of disabled persons, either through medical technologies or the tools of discipline, as Mich helpfully noted in the previous talk. Insofar as this is the case, right, the curative imaginary does not necessarily require cure as elimination. Indeed, in line with Claire's 2017 point, right, that cochlear implants don't meet the benchmark of cure because they don't eradicate hearing loss or restore lost hearing, despite what Apple's iPod or Apple's recent advertisements for its AirPods have claimed. The cochlear implant serves as a disciplinary tool to bring the disabled body in line with the expectations of normalcy, right? So rather than, say, provide ASL interpretation or ASL instruction as part of general education, the curative imaginary demands the development of a technological disciplinary apparatus to bring deaf persons in line with the expectations of normalcy. And here I want to I want to pause here to point out that this curative, this deployment of the curative imaginary pervades almost every every technological intervention into deafness, from cochlear implants to the several aborted attempts at developing wearable devices that translate sign language into spoken text, to algorithmically powered recognition technologies that would translate sign language into spoken text, right? These are all driven by a curative imaginary that seeks to discipline the deaf body in line with the expectations of a hearing world. And so, insofar as this is the case, non-deaf life, as indicated by these technologies, cannot be imagined as anything other than a space of intervention, and more specifically, a space where intervention is a moral imperative. Although there is some hope that this space in the in the curative imaginary is going away, and in the Q&A, you can I'd be happy to talk about that. So that being said, insofar as Claire is, or insofar as Kafer and others are drawing upon the idea of the imaginary or the imagination as fundamental to, indeed, the term curative imaginary, it, as a good pragmatist, I saw some compelling alignments with John Dewey's work on imagination. Now, to be clear, for the imagination, at least philosophically understood, is often treated as a particular kind of picture-making power, right? It is the stuff of child's dreams and flights of fancy, or if you were a medieval philosopher, the source from which you drew particular kinds of references, right? But for Dewey, imagination serves the function of binding together experience into a cohesive whole, right? Imagination is present in all of our particular kinds of activities in the world. And insofar as this is the case, imagination for Dewey is necessary for all conscious or rational thought. But insofar as this is the case, right? Imagination for Dewey allows us to resolve what he calls a problematic situation, or resolve what he calls problematic situations, or situations in which our equilibrium with the environment is disrupted. And within a problematic situation, we propose a variety of different ways of resolving the situation such that our equilibrium with the world is restored, right? Or when I teach my undergraduates about this aspect of Dewey's philosophy, I think I explain it to them in the context of, say, crossing a river, right? When you encounter a river that you need to cross, say you're hiking in the woods, the problematic situation is getting across the river. The various possibilities for resolving it include jumping over the river, wading through it, building a bridge, damming the river, so on and so forth. These possibilities are only sort of potential solutions to the problematic situation, what Dewey will occasionally refer to as an idea, until until the individual has actually reconstructed this problematic situation in mind. Dewey also refers to this reconstructive faculty of the imagination as speculation, hypothesization, conjecturing, suggesting. All of this is to say that the capacity for us to think through a situation and then project a possibility that we expect to be realized through the reconstruction of this situation is the work of imagination in our conscious experience, right? And again, the distinction between imagination understood in Dewey's context and the imagination as sort of contemporarily understood within philosophy is that The latter, imagination as flights of fancy, is typically concerned with thoughts that have no possibility of realization, right? Flying pink elephants and so on. Imagination as part of our ongoing conscious experience refers to the reconstruct or possibilities that we expect to be realized. Now, imagination further involves how we understand persons. Every encounter we have with a person involves an imaginative reconstruction of that person in light of our sort of normative expectations for the kinds of actions that persons engage in, or the particular capacities that persons are expected to possess in our encounter with them, right? And so this is what following Stephen Fessmeyer and Gregory Pappas enables the moral dimension of imagination, which, as Pappas notes, allows us to reach beyond our narrow view of things and understand others through sympathetic communication, right? This requires imagination as the projection of possibilities for a person.
We'll need to start coming to the end.
Yes, we're literally. Yeah, right. And so so viewed in this way, we can reformulate the curative imaginary in the following. Insofar as most of the literature on the curative imaginary tends to focus on future facing or crypt futures, we can ground the curative imaginary in the present moment of the encounter with disability. The curative imaginary is the ableist are those habits of thought that enable the ableist reconstruction of disability as lack or as a site for intervention. And in doing so, it restricts our capacities or restricts the capacity to understand the possibilities imminent in disabled life and disabled futures except through impairment, elimination, or intervention. And it shapes how folks reconstruct disabled persons in our social interaction. And social interaction for Dewey includes the built environment, other structures, things like technology. And thus the curative imaginary motivates technoableism through the ways that it reorganizes potential uses of technology in the mode of intervention, right? So, for example, Microsoft's AI for accessibility, which, Microsoft's, I have a lot to say about, but Microsoft's AI for accessibility engaged in a partnership with Mintra, which reduced or transformed disabled persons into collections of data, which it could then use to pair disabled persons with those tasks that are best suited for them. And this follows from a long history of the transformation of disability into something valuable for capitalist labor. And beyond this, insofar as AI systems co-constitute the self, our body and mind, through the collection of data about us, and then the use of that data to predict particular courses of action. Technologies used to predict disability all proceed from the curative imaginary insofar as they presume that an early diagnosis based on a collection of data, which itself brings with it a whole collection of problematic inheritances, based on the idea that an early diagnosis is a good outcome so that one can prevent the unfortunate future that is imagined to result from disability. That is to say, the predictive technology is built or proceeds from a curative imaginary that views itself as intervening early to prevent an unfortunate future, right? And thus, in my view, all predictive technologies that aim at intervening in disability are grounded in a curative imaginary and thus ableism itself. And finally, insofar as this is the case, the ways that algorithmic interventions into disability reconstruct disabled persons as in need of help or as lacking full agency. Again, Mintra is aimed or is an AI-powered job finding service that proceeds from the presumption that disabled persons often can't find work due to their inability to align fully with work environments organized around ability. Insofar as this is the case, these algorithmic interventions engage in a reconstruction of the disabled person in line with the curative imaginary, such that disabled persons are ontologically lacking. The very nature of being disabled is to possess a lack that is then remedied through the intervention of technology. And as Keys 2020 powerfully notes, in the context of autistic communication agents that are driven by algorithmic technologies, if autistic people are being constructed by AI practitioners as incapable of agency and full humanity in an ethical framework that treats agency and full humanity as mutual dependencies of each other, and both as necessary prerequisites for participating in the framework to address injustice, then we have an impasse. In short, the grounding of technoableism in the curative imaginary cuts short any possibility of disabled persons intervening in the ethical and moral implications of purportedly assistive technology, specifically assistive algorithmic technologies. And again, following Keys, disabled persons will then continue to be subject to both discursive and material violence, which will strip disabled persons of their ability to dispute either. And I think that's right on time. Yes.
Great. I think we have time for maybe just one question. There's one question here from Hypatia Sva. So, do you think that the issue with the tech is this curative imaginary? As this curative imaginary, is the tech itself or the way it's presented? And how do you think, in that context of tech imagination, not as cure but as expansion, that's transhumanism and the likes?
So transhumanism is also grounded in an implicit curative imaginary, because most transhumanists are like, well, we want to transcend the limitations of our frail human bodies. And they will, regardless of what rhetoric they use, they will always frame it as transcending human frailty. When said transcension would, at least in my view, involve leaving behind a large part of what makes us who we are, right? And to be clear, right, the problem is located the problem is located in the technology, its framing, and the world that makes possible such technologies and their framings, right? Because technology does not exist outside of the context in which it is produced. This is a science and technology a sort of cornerstone of STS. It's also a cornerstone of Dewey's philosophy of technology, and what I take to be generally true. And so, if you want sort of assistive algorithmic technologies that are not predicated on ableism, then you probably should transform the world into a non-ableist or less ableist place. Because until you engage in such transformation, you will continue to have technologies that reproduce the ableist assumptions and the curative imaginary. And to be clear, and so yes, Hypatia, without changing the whole world, all of tech will be tainted. Now, I know that's a bold claim, and one that folks tend to push back against. But if we think about the ways in which the majority of technologies that we take to be accessible technologies proceed from, say, research conducted by the military and industrial complex, right, there is an implicit connection between sort of this technologies. And so I am not saying that the use of the technology inherently makes one ableist or implies anti-disability sentiment. Again, Alison Kafer is and Eli Clare and others are very clear that just because a technology or just because the curative imaginary structure shapes certain ways of interacting with the world, certain choices to manage one's disabled experience, that does not mean that one has internalized the curative imaginary, right? So my use of pharmacological solutions to address my ADHD does not imply an adherence to the curative imaginary. It is the deployment of a piece of technology to better enable my transaction with the world. My concern is with the ways that the tools that are made available to us proceed from the curative imaginary, which subsequently limits the possibilities for the ways in which disabled persons can navigate and transact with the world. So, for example, I see Finn like gesturing, but so for example, you could probably make an LLM that worked very well for dyslexic persons if the LLM was trained on the experience of the dyslexic person and not drawn from a data set of assumptions about the experiences of dyslexia grounded or derived from non-disabled persons, right? So to just
I think we'll need to let the final speaker in.
Can I just intervene here for a
Yep.
minute? It's Shelley. I just want to say that I think that Jamie will be entirely amenable to staying a few minutes over 4 o'clock. So I don't think we should be too concerned about the time.
Oh, okay, great. Oh, sorry.
So yeah. So to address the question, just because you use a LLM or algorithmic intervention where you're to enable your transaction with the world does not mean you've internalized the curative imaginary. But if we follow the principles of technoscience, it does mean that we should bear in mind the ways in which the technology that enables our smooth transaction with the world proceeds from the curative imaginary. And in bearing that in mind, we might consider ways that we could, say, crip these technologies.
Great. Okay, so I think we should now go on to the final speaker of the panel. So that's going to be Damien Williams. By way of introduction, Damien is an assistant professor in philosophy and data science at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, with a doctorate in STS from Virginia Tech and a master's in philosophy and comparative religious studies from Georgia State University. His research explores the intersections and implications of philosophy, technology, categories of knowledge, religious traditions, public policy, justice, marginalization, and human social values. So take it away, Damien.
Thank you very much, Finn. Thank you, everyone. Thankfully, a lot of the kind of groundwork for what I want to talk about today has been laid by my fellow panelists. So thank you all very much as well. I very much appreciate that. Johnathan, if you saw my laugh reaction, you'll see why towards the end of my presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and share some slides, and I would like to just kind of begin by laying out this kind of framework of what I've been doing for a little while, the places that some of these conversations have come from, and some of the people to whom I owe intellectual debt and gratitude for helping me think through some of these ideas. Let me go ahead and get the slideshow started and pull up my notes. All right. So the title of my presentation is Fascist Bullshit, How Generative AI Enacts and Enables Authoritarianism and Eugenics. I want to highlight that, as has been discussed multiple times throughout our conversation today, it is not necessarily the case that when we're talking about generative AI or we're talking about any technology, we're necessarily talking about these things in a deterministic fashion. That is to say, we're not thinking about them as being completely determinative of what will happen with them, or what will happen through them, or what will happen to us if we use them. I am, in this case, talking about technologies as influential. They have a way of co-creating our experience. They have affordances which tend them towards certain types of uses and certain types of outcomes. But that tendency is not insurmountable necessarily. That tendency is a framework that, as Johnathan just pointed out at the end of the Q&A, this is something that we can, when we are aware of it, actively and intentionally push against. So to start from that understanding as a whole, I'm going to be using a lot of case studies, examples, and a few anecdotes to kind of highlight instances of what I mean when I talk about how generative AI in particular fosters, enacts, enables authoritarianism and eugenics and eugenical thought and understanding in the world. And I'm going to kind of weave my argument in and through those examples as they'll be used as touchstones throughout. My work on this sits in accord with and draws from Meredith Broussard's work on techno-chauvinism, Patricia Hill Collins's and others' Black feminist thought, Black feminist epistemology, Dr. Ashley Shu's Technoableism, specifically the work done on Technoableism and AI, but also her longer work against Technoableism out in 2023. Rule Williams's no relation new monograph, Disabling Intelligences, which talks about the kind of eugenic underpinnings of AI as a concept and intelligence writ large as a concept. I'll also be talking some STS concepts, some science and technology studies, science, technology, and society kind of ideas like actor network theory, the social shaping of technology, and I'll also be touching on some Franz Fanon and Paulo Freire and others. As we kind of go forward. Primary concepts that I'm looking at here think about things like epistemology, knowledge, how we understand ourselves, but also what then becomes legible, what becomes real, what becomes experienceable through the frameworks that we can use to know things. That mechanism can be directly impacted by our social framings, but also our technological uses, our engagements with others, our understandings and new ideas that get introduced to us. And so with that in mind, I want to give us a very little tiny bit about how generative AI does and does not work. This slide has two images on it. One is an animated GIF that is a vector map containing 4 words, man, woman, king, and queen. And it shows ray arrow relationships and vectorized relationships between those words. The vectorized arrows show the relationship along the gender axis and along the royalty axis. So man and king are connected by royalty, as are queen and woman. And man and woman are connected by gender, as are king and queen. This is an animated vectorized map that kind of describes a little bit of how words get embedded in the vector space in language models and in large language models. They are literally arranged based on given assessments of numerical value, and then they are arranged based on how close or distant they are from each other. That determination is made by a statistical counting, a regularity counting of how often they appear near to each other and how near to each other they appear within the corpora that are used to train language models and large language models. So you give it a whole big raft of text and it counts all the words and it determines how close and how far away from each other the words are, and it develops statistical relationality for those words based on that counting. The more words you give it, the idea goes, for large language models anyway, the more words you give it, the more it has to work with, the more ideas it can build off of. This has been questioned in recent years, with many starting to see that you can get very good results from language models without having them to be in the trillions of tokens, right? Tokens being what those words become when they are vectorized, when they are numericized. That relationship is a contextual connotative relationship. And so what you see when you see gender bias, racial bias, ableist bias come out of large language model structures is you are seeing the regularities of those biases as they are present within the corpora that those models have been trained on, right? You see fewer instances of models being able to talk about or understand sentences that talk about a female president or a female doctor or a female CEO because it has been trained on data that shows it far less often any of those things being realities in the world. And so as it tries to map and match those realities to replicate those patterns, it replicates those prejudicial biases that are inherent within those things. Now, the argument goes for many, what happens is you're just talking about the way the world has been. This is true. There have been fewer CEOs who have been understood as female. There are fewer female presidents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are fewer Black presidents than white presidents. All of those things are true facts about the world. So what the LLM, what the model is doing, is replicating those facts. And if we were simply talking about a system that's used to replicate facts about things that have been true in the past, that would be well and good. But since we are talking about systems that are used to make determinations about what is the case now and what ought to be the case in the future, people use these systems to make policy, to discuss how things should be, to make determinations about who gets hired for what jobs, who gets admitted into what colleges. Since those things are what these systems are used for, those prejudicial biases being built into them at the very foundational level matters quite a great deal. The image on the other side, apart from the GIF, is actually an OpenAI sourced step-by-step map of how words get embedded in the vector space. So take that with a handful of salt. But it gives you a 3-step process by which you see a prompt is sampled, the labeler demonstrates the desired output for the behavior. The data is used to fine-tune the model. This was based on GPT 3.5. Then you collect comparison data, train a reward model. You give it a reason to want to match that expected desired behavior. You give it the processes and tools by which to do so. A labeler comes in again and ranks the outputs, best to worst. Then you train the reward model again, use those framings. Then you go through in step 3, you optimize that policy against the reward model using the kind of reinforcement learning algorithm. New prompt sampled, PPO model initialized, the policy generates the output, the reward model calculates the reward, and excuse me, I actually didn't mean to change that. I apologize. The reward model calculates the reward for the output, and the reward is used to update the policy that will generate a likely type of output going into the future. This is, in general, how GPTs and large language model type systems work. Right? All of that was relatively technical, but the basic framework of it is they give you the words and phrases that you are most likely to accept based on your input and what it has been trained upon as its training data and expected processes for behavior. The goal of a large language model is to produce an output that is statistically most likely to be accepted by the prompter. Full stop. It is not to produce truth. It is not to produce fact. It is to be accepted by the prompter. As such, that framework means that we are not looking at something that when it gets something wrong, it is not quote unquote hallucinating. It's not quote unquote lying to you. I and others use the framework of the Harry Frankfurt model, the epistemological context of bullshit. The bullshitter is not lying to you. They are not telling you the truth. They are saying the thing that they hope you will accept. And whether that correlates to the truth or not, they don't necessarily care. That's not in the goal structure for what they're trying to do. They're just trying to get you to accept what they have to say. So hallucinations are inherent within the system of large language models because hallucinations are produced by the exact same structures, the exact same processes by which any output that a large language model creates is produced. It is the same process. A hallucination is just a large language model output that we don't like because it doesn't conform to reality as we understand it. it does not do the thing we want it to do. This has also been kind of acknowledged and accepted by most CEOs of AI companies. You have Sam Altman, you have Tim Cook, you've got pretty much every major large language model AI company CEO saying you're never going to get hallucinations out of the models because hallucinations are what the models do. That's how they work. So that has implications. We have talked a bit about what it means to think about AI in the context of schooling, in the context of education. And there's been some very solid points made that the idea of just kind of removing AI from education as a whole doesn't really address the kind of core idea as to why people make use of AI, what's actually happening. But I do want to highlight that there are studies right now that do show, and they do use this kind of framework of critical skills development or critical thinking or foundational skills to talk about what isn't being done when an immediate and initial over-reliance on AI is the norm. But to be clear, that's about an immediate and initial over-reliance on AI. That's the idea that you're just letting it do things for you without critically reflecting on what it is that they do, without engaging the outputs, without thinking through what has been presented to you. And when that happens, what then happens is that you do see students who will not, in fact, use their own tools at hand or will not creatively try to address a problem, even when given the opportunity to not simply write out a rote paper in a 5-page essay format, but to actually create an assignment, to engage something that they themselves can generatively create. They will instead defer to the system. And that does have long-term impacts on what gets done and what is capable of being done when those systems are no longer available to those students. And it doesn't just happen to students. One of the images here, these are a series of headlines from various studies that were done. One of the images is about the impact of generative AI on critical thinking, self-reported reductions in cognitive effort and confidence from a survey of knowledge workers. This is from Microsoft. This was people who saw themselves less capable of doing their jobs as they might like to when AI tools were removed from them. We'll see some other things that kind of point in this direction. Now, all of this does depend upon this framework of this idea of what it means to be intelligent or what it means to do cognitive work. This idea of education as this process of thinking or working or developing one's skills in a particular way. And all of that is rightly questioned as the necessarily inherent in any way, shape, or form. However, one of the things that we do want, and we do say that we kind of understand to want across the board, is for people to be able to creatively express themselves and to uptake and engage with information, skills, and tools in a way that allows them to enhance their experiences rather than simply offloading their experiences. Now, again, when that is done, when that kind of reflective, careful engagement is the norm, that's what we see as the outcome. We see people engaging these systems in a way that does and can build skills in a helpful way. But that is not the necessary, habitual, inherent framework by which these systems are given to the public or to students. This is not the frame in which they're talked about. These systems are talked about, they're sold as being one-size-fits-all answer machines. And when that is the case, that framework then becomes something that people think they can just inherently trust, that they don't necessarily have to check it. To this end, see ChatGPT last spring semester offering students free ChatGPT access right around finals time, right? Like that framework of just handing people something that say is going to give them all the answers that they need and not telling them, not showing them, not helping them to think critically through and with it, that pushes a sense in Broussard's framework of techno-chauvinism that these tools, these systems can and should be relied upon, that they should be trusted over and above other people in your life. Now, it might be the case that those systems have something important to offer, but being the sole arbiter of what it is that we understand and how we understand it in the world is not necessarily a benefit. Here we have headlines, 100 Days of Doge, assessing the use of data and AI to reshape government. RFK's Make America Healthy Again report seems riddled with AI slop. Dozens of erroneous citations carry chatbot markers, and some sources simply don't exist. Louisiana regulators approve energy plans for Meta's AI data center. And then we have an image of a little girl soaking wet in a life preserver carrying a soaking wet puppy sitting in the bow of a boat. That is an AI generated image. That image was one of dozens that was making its way around the internet when Hurricane Helene hit the Southeast here in the United States. And they were used as a way of kind of mimetically marking a lack of response from the Federal Emergency Management Agency. People saying, this is what happens when you let FEMA try to respond to a hurricane, and using AI generated images, usually of young, like Caucasian female coded children carrying dogs in the soaking rain, looking sad, as the way of saying, this is what's happening out in the world. None of these images were real. And in fact, FEMA's response to Hurricane Helene was not ideal, especially in the earliest parts of it, but it did, in fact, turn around very quickly. And even once it did, it was seen as a hazard, as a harm. So that framework is difficult to kind of square in this space, right? But what I use these kind of headlines to say is that if we take this kind of uncritical framing, this acceptance of AI without a critical reflection or engagement, what we have is the groundwork of propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. Disinformation being intentionally spread, erroneous information, and misinformation being not necessarily intentionally, but it still spreads. It misinforms others. Authoritarian frameworks love this because it destabilizes the grounding of knowledge and expertise. It sounds confident even when it's factually wrong. It broadly conforms to and reproduces biases right out of the off the shelf. It lets people create bespoke realities with evidence that say that this is true, this is what's happening. It devalues and says that it is less likely or less necessary to think about human creativity, degrades trust, and destroys shared contextual knowledge and expertise. Even things like liar's dividends come into play here, where we can't trust the knowledge, then maybe nothing is true. Maybe that's not real. Maybe the real thing is fake. And that only serves to help those who don't really care about the grounding of knowledge. It does all this in a format that people can claim is objective, is just true, is real. And it lets people offload their responsibility and obfuscate their intentions through that. This the girl with the puppy thing. I had somebody. I was researching these on Facebook, and I saw somebody using one of these images, and somebody in the comments said, "That's an AI image. This isn't true." And they said, "Yeah, maybe the image is AI, but that doesn't mean the story's not real." That's a difficulty. That's a problem. So, as we think about these, we also have to think about the places in which those biases are then built into systems like regulatory processes, policymaking. Loan servicers using AI models see the reproduction of old redlining type biases in brand new models. And you have 6,000 loans that were assessed, and you have Black and Hispanic loan applicants being approved for loans at significantly, massively lower rates. You have ChatGPT being biased against resumes with credentials that imply a disability at all. This survey showed that if you had any mention of disability in your resume or your CV, even if it was an award you got, showing your leadership and your dedication in the disability community, your resume would be less likely to be ranked by the AI system. It would, in fact, be moved to the bottom of the pile. because disability is bad so far as these systems have been taught. Inherent in this is this understanding that ableism is the norm, and it becomes the framework by which all of these decisions then get made. I said that I would come back around to this kind of de-skilling problem. You've got doctors who use AI, finding themselves over-relying on the systems. These are people who have been trained to be critical, to be reflective, but are perhaps oftentimes looking for ways to kind of be more efficient in their job because they have, well, intense jobs, time-consuming. But once those tools are introduced, when they're removed, doctors saw a 20% reduction in their own diagnostic capability without tools available to them. That's a massive, massive loss. That's not back to baseline. That's 20% below where they started. That has real implications long term. And then you have groups like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network saying that they will not use generative AI in plain language specifically because it changes how people think about themselves, how people understand themselves, how they can know themselves. And this gets to this kind of question of what I talked about when I said, the words hermeneutic injustice. The removal of the ability to understand ourselves, the systems and framework for understanding the world and for our own situation within it. These frameworks are fundamentally necessary for us to have dignity in the world, for us to be able to say, this is who I am, this is what my experience is, this is what I understand to be true about me and about how I relate to the world. On this slide, we have 3 pieces of text and 1 book cover. Oh wow, the piece of text that I'm looking at is upside down, and that's bizarre. That was not like that when I came in here. My apologies, everyone. It's going to take me a second to kind of adjust to. The first framework on the side is an email exchange between Ruel Williams and an unnamed colleague. And the unnamed colleague sends the email. The AI design of your email is clever, but significantly lacks warmth. Would it be possible to be contacted by a human being moving forward instead of AI? Many thanks. To which Dr. Williams responded, "It's not AI. I'm just autistic. See you next Friday." There's a long-standing habit of countenancing or categorizing autistic and other neurodivergent individuals as quote unquote robotic, as not having real human affect, as in some way being stilted, as in some way being less real. And this comes down to both a misunderstanding of neurodivergent affect, but also a habit that happens within the neurodivergent individuals in which we sometimes seek to kind of over-explain or be over careful and precious in our language choices as a way of masking, as a way of making sure that we're not misunderstood. And that can come off sometimes as robotic, perhaps, or at least what others might categorize it as. This gets replicated within systems like this, and you see M dashes being taken up as quote unquote markers of AI. I've been using M dashes in my writing since I was 10 years old. Since I learned how to make those keys with the Alt on the keyboard, I have used those. I love them. I like M dashes. I like ellipses. I like commas way too much. You will not convince me that an M dash is somehow indicative of AI. But what you can understand through this is that an M dash is found in a lot of writing by neurodivergent individuals and is found in writing by carefully constructed writers who seek to be clear and understood in particular ways, and it replicates those things. But what this then means is that people who read this material think that they can identify AI on sight. They know what it looks like. They know what it means. And very often, what that means is non-native English speakers or neurodivergent individuals being singled out because their writing looks not quite right. In Ruel Williams's Disabling Intelligence, they highlight this idea about what AI does to us, what it means to have this in our lives in a day-to-day framework, and how what happens is that we tend to think that we have to be good enough. We have to meet the standard of intelligence in our writings, our expressions, our creativity, because this eugenic framework of what intelligence means requires of us a certain level of performance, a certain level of being a particular kind of way, the right kind of thinker, the right kind of speaker, the right kind of professional. And all of those things have these expectations, these assumptions that there is even any such thing as a right kind of person. Those expectations are inherently ableist, inherently eugenicist, and their replication, their expectation, turns on all of us. These expectations that if you are not of that right kind, then you must conform yourself to that right kind by any means necessary, or be excluded. The piece that's upside down in the top corner is the anecdote, another anecdote from Dr. Williams, in which they highlight that one of their students, they noted that one of their students' writing quality had shifted kind of drastically. And the student was a non-native English speaker who had begun using generative AI to quote unquote correct their writing to make it sound more white. Because that expectation of a certain type of right kind of professionalism, a right kind of voice, was something that they were feeling on all sides. It's not a stylistic choice. It's literally just, I don't know what happened. It was bright side up when I started my slides, and now it's not. Sorry. If others would like me to share their slides later, I can, I'll fix that before I do. One of the things that I'm talking about in all of this is this notion of paradigmatic capture, this idea of who controls the idea, the definition, the conversation behind a thing, and how this thing gets used and understood in the world. Whoever controls the conversation, controls the definition, controls the conversation, and whoever controls the conversation can shape the cultural narrative about a thing, in this case, technology, AI, what it means for this thing to be in the world, what good it supposedly does, and the place it's supposed to have. Think about who tries to sell us AI at all costs, no matter what. No consent, no copyright, no choice of whether to opt in, let alone to opt out. What they stand to gain from that uptake. And then we remember that in this case, obfuscation, disinformation, and misinformation are mechanisms of control. These are ways by which people are placed into a specific relationship and are categorized and controlled into particular types of relationality to each other, to technology, to the world, to themselves. Again, the broad cultural and material paradigm of AI degrades not just trust in, but the ability to critically engage with, determine the value of, categorize, and intentionally, sincerely consider new ways of organizing and understanding facts to produce knowledge about the world. It changes how we think and what we can think with. Over-reliance on generative AI breaks us down and gives us a thing that we then take off the shelf and depend on. Fascism, authoritarianism, depends on this acceptance of off-the-shelf frameworks and metrics, and it depends on a hearkening back to a tradition, a period of an imagined perfect time, a certain particular right kind, right way of being, in which an idealized perfect group of people who all shared the same values, who all shared the same way of being, way of expressing themselves, all used to exist together. But the fact of the matter is, and this is extraordinarily important, no such time ever existed. No such time was ever real. There is no pure, perfect, right kind of person. There are only the multifaceted, multivalent ways of being in the world. Here I draw on Hannah Arendt, Umberto Eco, and their discussions of fascism to kind of really think through what this means. It creates the conditions by which authoritarians can cement their control, which they can tell others that if they just use this system or think this way or behave this way, then everything will be perfect again, quote unquote. Everything will go back to that time before when things were good and right. We can get rid of crime. We can get rid of deviancy. We can get rid of all of these ways of being. All you have to do is use this, believe this, experience the world this way and no other way. And so, again, it's kind of telling where and when and how these tools get pushed on us without our ability to resist.
I'm just. Oh, I think this is at the end, isn't it? This is a habit of mine. Sorry. Great.
No,
Thanks.
you're absolutely fine, and I appreciate, because I will go long if left unchecked. That's just true. We cannot, in fact, techno-fix our way out of values problems. It is not the case that we can make just the right new tech, the right new piece of shiny thing that will allow us to fix everything and solve everything forever. Solutionism is, as Craig Slee puts it, ableism in and of itself. Solutionism, the goal for a fix, is that goal for having the right kind enacted. There is no fix to a values problem. There's only the hard work of sorting through what those values are. Marginalized people are disproportionately harmed by the uncritical spread of generative AI in particular, because the people who are spreading it out and who are encouraging its uncritical use are essentially seeking to get people to believe that the machine is simultaneously like us, the marginalized, the neurodivergent, the disabled, and thus can speak for us, even as it pressures the user to disregard actual us when we tell you, no, it isn't, and no, it can't. These frameworks let us think, if we are careful, if we are intentional, if we are clear, they let us think about what these systems are, what they do, what they don't do, and how they could be made differently. Whether what we have should be built and used at all, and what we could do and build instead. This meme is Zoidberg from Futurama, by the way. He's a lobster man wearing a tuxedo. And he's sitting next to Hermes Conrad and Professor Farnworth, and he is saying, your AI and algorithmic interventions are bad, and you should feel bad. I don't want to say that that's the only thing there is to say about it, but it is to say, what might we do otherwise? And how do we begin? Thank you all.
Well, that was great. So we have a bit of time for questions here. We have one from Shelley in the chat. So what are your recommendations for how to discern AI-generated content on social media and elsewhere? That's a tough one.
So one of the things that's actually increasingly difficult is that we live in the lag time. We live in the gap between when something happens, when a new piece of technology comes out, and when we are able to determine its output, or discern its output, rather. So that image of the little girl with the puppy, that's from like a year and a half ago, right? Hurricane Helene, October 2023. No, 2024, sorry. And so that that moment in time, that image was actually like really convincing to a large swath of people. Most people who are visually assessing images at this point look at that image now and go, nope, this is why that's AI. This thing over here is all weird. The texture of the fur on the puppy is all too smooth. The lighting is weird. Like, we can mark out exactly what makes it weird. And we've developed those skills of discernment. However, you look at the output from Sora, OpenAI's image generating content right now. You look at the outputs from Gemini, and we don't yet have the exact markers to know and discern, unless something very, very weird is happening in the video, something that just can't happen in normal everyday life as we think of it. We can't tell the difference yet. So there's not so much a single framework for discerning these things at present as there is a habit of checking sources and checking outputs against multiple sources. So if you see an image and you are unsure as to whether that image is verifiable, look for corroboration elsewhere. Look for other trusted sources. look for frameworks that do this work. That's for us individually. There's a structural thing that can be done about these kinds of tools. There are ways of making it such that the output is watermarked, that the output is stenographically linked or, highlighted in such a way that you can tell this came from an image generator, this came from an AI system, this came from an, some kind of generative process. There are ways of mandating that happen and that be woven in at the kind of mathematical level that builds these systems and tools. There is very little political will right now towards making sure that happens. We exist in a regulatory moment where it is unlikely that we will see that kind of thing pushed at a federal level, possibly state by state, but a widespread federal level, not for a few years.
Okay. So there isn't anything else in the Q&A, and we have gone over a little, so I think that'll bring us to a close. With I'd like to thank all of our speakers for a bunch of really interesting talks, and also anyone that contributed comments in the chat. I see that there's been a symposium of sorts going on in there as well.
Hey, great.
you.
Thank you very much, Fintan. You've done a great job chairing, and I'd like to thank the speakers in the session. All of the talks were really informative and really, I think, groundbreaking, and so I really appreciate all of them. Thank you so much. I hope that everyone will join us tomorrow, because we have another day of tremendous presentations planned. So be here at 10 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. Thank you very much.